His nose woke up first. It shook Samir from his slumber and he sat upright in bed, sniffing out the storm before it began. Sliding from underneath the mosquito net covering his four-poster bed, he walked up to the window and opened its shutters. Ominous clouds had begun collecting, the moon camouflage. Staring up at the firmament, he cupped his chin with both hands, resting his elbows upon the windowsill. It would arrive shortly. He could smell it. It would materialize out of nowhere with the crack of bright light and thunder. So he waited, for it was impossible to sleep through an imminent storm. 10 years earlier, when he had opened his mouth for the first time, a crying, breathing, living being, the bedroom window had flung open, and a gust of wind had swept into the room where it was swallowed completely by the newborn. Samir, his parents would name him. Samir, meaning a gust of wind. Samir, the boy who'd swallowed the monsoon. Thank you.
Aanchal, unlike non-fiction, it's sometimes difficult to categorize a novel as layered and as rich as the Book of Everlasting Things. Some have been quick to call it a partition novel. But how would you, in your head, really categorize the book? Where does it sit? Is it a partition novel, or is it at its heart a love story between two people who are just victims of circumstances and of time? I'd really be interested to know that.
That's a great question, and I think it's very easy for people to assume that because I'm a partition historian, I would work on a partition novel, and for a large part, the novel is about partition, and it is a love story, both of the things you said. But I would always categorize it as a family novel. For me, the protagonists of the novel are not the two lovers, but the young boy Samir and his uncle Vivek. So for me, it is a generational novel that has partition as a landscape. It has World War I as a landscape. It has post-partition migrations and the rehabilitation that refugees had to go through as another landscape. It has acclimatizing to the West as a landscape. And of course, the ancient arts of perfumery and calligraphy and a generally sensorial landscape.
Which we'll come to
Yeah.
in a bit. I wanted also to understand a bit about the time span of the novel. It begins in 1937 Lahore with Samir and Firdaus, who are children, but then the story goes back to the battlefields of the First World War and then goes forward almost to present times, covering a span of 100 years. So why did you want to write a generational saga rather than, say, a novel that would stay focused around the time of the partition?
I guess the question that I ask myself is, are stories about partition just about the time of partition? Or are they actually stories that build to the context of partition? And then after the event, are we still reckoning with the aftershock of it? Which in real life, in my work in oral history, I see very often that partition does not end with the generation that lived it, but rather it is felt or ignored by various generations that come after. So even if my center of the novel, let's say, is partition or could be partition, I will have to build up to that. And there is a whole history of a family that builds up to that particular seminal event. And then unfolding from that event, a history opens up in itself. So yes, Samir and Firdaus lived through partition, and it really triggers the changes of their lives. It is the before and after event. But Samir's family has been through World War I and then World War II. And all of that trauma also is carried into the living of partition. And then after, where does he go? Where does Firdaus go after partition? So I think generational memory is very important. Generational history is very important. It does not always mean generational trauma as well. Generational storytelling is important because we are products of our history and our future will be products of us, you know.
True. The curious connections of Samir and Firdaus's families. You spoke about families, and I wanted to come to that. The complicated flow of their family trees that spans continents tells the fascinating generational stories of many people from the subcontinent. How, you've already answered that, but maybe tell us a bit more on when you were actually thinking about the book. How integral were the family stories to this?
For those of you that don't know, in my life, not as a novelist, I am an oral historian. I go around the subcontinent, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, the UK as well, recording stories of families that lived through partition, acknowledging that the person that lived through partition is not the only one that's emotionally impacted by it. When you accumulate a certain number of stories, and by that I mean dozens, hundreds, and different versions of those stories because you're speaking to multiple family members about them, you start to think that maybe I can also write a story like this. Maybe I can piece together some parts of many interviews to make a composite world. And then also there is the interest in the real world of those events. Is reality malleable enough for you to open up and insert fictional characters and for those characters to be absorbed into that reality? So as I was thinking of the world of the book, I was thinking of these questions. I was asking myself, are you good enough to be a novelist yourself, because you've never done it?
I think we found the answer to that.
Well, I mean, I don't know, right? It's very difficult to write a novel when compared to writing real life stories which are in front of you. I don't think of myself as a particularly imaginative person, which is why your question is really important, because it means that I had to draw everything from reality, not just the shape of the room or what a person is wearing or where their accent is from, but also the vocabulary that they are using, the words that they are saying. I remember this in the novel, late in the novel, Firdaus says this one thing where she says, if you've read the blurb of the novel, you know Samir and Firdaus get separated, so it's not a spoiler. But late in life, Firdaus says this line where she's thinking about Samir, and she says, for 10 years, he mixed with me. And this particular line is something a lady said to me in Bengal when I was doing oral history work about the courtship that her and her husband went through for a few months. And she said he mixed with me in the sense that we got to know each other. But the phraseology of one human mixing into another was so beautiful and unique to her context and her experience, her feeling. And it fit for Firdaus because they came from the same era. So I am very grateful to my interviews because they lent that very particular vocabulary of the time, not just about partition or about the war, but how people saw each other, the language they used to refer to each other. So I very much need my historical work to write my fictional work.
Actually, picking up from that, one aspect is the research that goes into fiction and non-fiction, and the other is also the process of writing. So was the process of actually constructing a novel very different for you, and was it extremely difficult? What did you actually think in terms of how you'd actually put it together in a linear way?
Yes, it was very difficult. No, it truly is very, I have so much respect for novelists, because just the feat of imaginations that go into constructing a narrative is something that when you're working on nonfiction, which is available to you either through fieldwork or archive, it's not something you consider. But the method of my writing was not very different, or rather the method of my research was not very different. I am a meticulous planner when it comes to the structure of any of my books. But in this case, I plotted, I subplotted, I plotted for those tiny little plots as well, because the novel was so large. There are so many different time periods, character arcs. There are many characters that I follow from birth to death, which is a massive feat because, you know, when we think of the arc of our life, we think of it in the bigger moments that happen to us. But when you're writing about a person's life, you have to include all the little stuff as well, like she bathed and she washed her hands and she, what did you wear? And these are things that really stump me. What did you wear in 1946? How did you do your hair? Did you wear makeup? These are the things I was thinking about, which are really stupid things if you think about the large arc of the novel you're writing. But these were the things that stumped me. The other challenge of writing something that included a hugely violent aspect of partition where a lot has been written, and then the hugely violent landscape of World War I where not a lot has been written, and to infuse humanity into a warscape was very hard. Because again, we view partition and wars through the lens of violence. We don't really view them through the lens of humans, or human feeling, rather. So as I was writing, I think I borrowed from the empathy of oral history to write this. It was not very different, but it was more difficult because there were many things I didn't know. Like, you rely on archive, which I didn't really have to do for oral history. So far, far, far more difficult to write a novel than to write nonfiction.
But also at the same time, given that it is fiction and the fact that you can actually also weigh in on large parts of imagination, did you find that constraining or did you find that liberating?
So a bit of both. I think the biggest challenge was myself. As a historian, how much history do you want in your historical fiction? And who apart from you actually cares about it? So the good thing is that you can pick up the book, and if you walk on the streets of Lahore, or you walk on the streets of Paris, or you are in the battlefields of Neuchâtel, or anywhere in Flanders, you will be able to find your way. That's the good thing. That's the historian in me. But this is also a hindrance for when you're writing something creative, that you want there to be accuracy in every single line. The novel is richer for it, but it means that your hurdles are a lot more,
I read somewhere that about the inspiration, that a chance encounter with someone in Lahore said that they were writing on the gravestone of their grandparents with wet cement, and that sparked the idea.
That sparked the idea for one scene in the novel.
Right.
I'll tell you the
tell us
scene.
about
I'll
that?
tell you the scene. I will not give spoilers away, though. I'll just tell you the scene because it's very tender, actually. So, in the novel, one of my characters, his wife dies, and when she dies, he buries her, but he's too impatient. He doesn't want to wait for a gravestone. He's also very overcome with sadness. So he takes a small piece of wet cement and he writes her name on it. And that remains the gravestone for the entirety of her life in that grave. Many years ago, when I was in Lahore doing field work, I was speaking to a family from Samana, which is a part of Punjab in India. They had come from Samana, they had gone to Multan, and then they'd gone to Lahore. And after they migrated for nearly 50 years, or maybe 60 years, no one from the family was able to visit Samana. And then it happened. Someone could come because of some government connection somewhere. And that gentleman went to Samana and he saw the graves that his family used to have there. And he visited his ancestors. And he saw that they had no gravestones. So again, he took a piece of wet cement and he wrote everyone's name by hand. And when his daughter went many years later and she found that gravestone, there was something like, how do I explain it? Like, after someone has died, there is a human touch to the grave. And it was so tender and so moving and so tactile that it stayed with me. And yeah, I knew that if I ever wrote anything imaginative, it would find its place in that. But there are so many such moments. There's another moment where another character, his wife also dies. This is not a pattern, but just mere coincidence. But when she dies and when he goes to cremate her, and then after he cremates her, he is picking up her bones. He takes one of her bones and he keeps it because it's a part of her. And when he feels unsure or anxious about life, he holds the bone and he talks to it. It sounds a bit weird, but it makes him believe that she's there. And this was my own grandmother. When my grandfather died, she had a bone of his, and she kept it close until she died. So there are things, I think, as a novelist, you borrow from the world around you.
I wanted to touch upon the art in the book. So Samir is a master perfumist. Firdaus is an expert calligrapher. Both child prodigies. The often underappreciated art of understanding and recreating smells, and the equally fine art of producing calligraphy. Both have a very, very important place in the book. Can you tell us a little more about these particular inspirations and maybe also the kind of research you took for both?
You make them sound like great characters, by the way. But I will say early success is a terrible teacher, right? So yeah, they indulge in these very archaic, almost, now we would call them arts that are dying out. But they were arts at the time that were flourishing and very visceral. They were sensorial. They were extensions of your nose and your hands and your fingers. Part of the reason is selfish, because I am trained as an artist and I wanted to return to that world of creativity and sensuality. But part of it is to pay homage to arts that are no longer as celebrated. That being said, though, I'm obviously not a perfumer. So while I may have learned calligraphy as a part of my training in paper making and all that stuff, I could draw from those experiences. But to write about perfume is such a specific and unique vocabulary. And I shadowed a perfumer for 5 years, two in fact, one in France and one in Kannauj, to be able to understand not just how perfumes are made or how a flower becomes a liquid, and the distillation process and the science and everything behind it, but also how does a perfumer exist in a world that is so assaulted by smell. There is so much smell around us. How do they focus on one thing? How do they distill? How do they give words to something that's abstract? So by shadowing, I mean literally sometimes walking behind, I mean living with, observing how they smell a cup of tea, and also the very specifically scientific vocabulary of making perfumes, because perfumery is equal parts chemistry and poetry. So I don't have a great nose, but the more you smell, the better you smell. So definitely by the end of those 5 years, I could differentiate between a powdery rose, a musky rose, a trampled rose, a desi gulab, a Bulgarian rose, just as an example, because I had interacted with it so much over the course of years.
They say there is a lot of the personal sometimes in especially your first work of fiction. What's your relationship with Firdaus, in the sense that how much of her is you? And she makes certain choices which obviously determine the course of what happens, and some choices are made for her. Would you be making those choices? How do you feel about Firdaus?
She was a complicated character to write, and it's strange that I suppose being a woman, I felt Samir's life was more relatable than hers somehow, which is why he takes up a majority of the novel and not her. But Firdaus and I definitely share, as do many characters in the book. I think you can't help but put yourself, but write about maybe two things. Write about what you know, and then write about what you may have done in that situation at that time period. So one of the major decisions Firdaus takes in her life is to choose duty over desire. And it really, I don't think she understands how much of her life it will impact at the time. But it is a very classic case of the politics of the world making decisions for you rather than you doing it yourself. Mostly because you are a woman in a man's world at that time. Much of it is still true, but a lot has changed since then. But she was definitely a woman in a man's time, and she knew it, And she felt it more so in that moment, making that decision, than any other time. She also felt that being raised as such an independent person by her father was as if it was leading up to that moment. It was, he has given me freedom, so he can take it away at some point. And she realized that in that moment. I don't think I felt something directly like that, but again, I think spending time with women who were young women at the time of partition, who had decisions made for them either in their personal life or in their professional life or lack thereof, perhaps I resonated with that. I was empathetic to her. She had a much better life than Samir. She had a much happier life than Samir despite the decision that she took. So maybe I was kinder to her, but I felt more connected to Samir. Samir is the anchor, I think, for me.
I think we have time for a couple of audience questions, but before that, do you want to maybe read another short passage, or should we go straight to the questions?
Well, I don't know.
What would everyone like? Would you like another reading?
Oh,
There you
well.
go.
It's a really interesting question about Firdaus, though no one has asked me about her. Okay, I'll read the moment that they meet. I'll read that little bit. And they're children at this time, so they're just like 10 and 9 years old. Half a year into his internship, Samir was crouched on the ground at the back of the shop, obscured behind a glass cabinet. He drowned each bottle in a bowl of hot water and then, using his fingernails, peeled off the gummy, worn-out labels. He had barely gotten through half the lot when he stopped. Bottle still in hand, he inhaled deeply with closed eyes as a new smell snaked around him. Everything about it was ordinary, yet something stood out so clearly that he was unable to ignore it. He smelled her before he saw her. Lifting his nose above the curtain of his already perfumed environment, he detected rose and orange peels mixed with multani mitti and besan. Someone had walked into the shop carrying the remnants of uptan. But there was something else, something extraordinary adhering to this ordinary smell. It was musky, warm, soft, calming, sweet. Yes, it was also sweet. Immediately he recalled the bottle of the same sweet substance from a faraway island called Haiti, a highly prized ingredient called vanilla. Could it be? Samir dropped the bottle in the water and smelled further. Hints of something vaguely smoky floated into his nostrils. Was it leather or pepper? No, neither. It was more rudimentary, denser, like kajal. Allowing this composition to expand his smile and also, it seemed, his heart, he took in another deep inhale. Effortlessly overpowering all else was the rose, for a rose could never hide. And just as he brought his nose down from the air, he found a pair of pistachio-colored eyes staring at him through the rows of glass bottles. It was her, the wearer. It was her.